Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Alicia Christensen. I'm an Education and Outreach Associate with Series at CU Boulder. We are having a few technical difficulties this afternoon, and so just give us a few minutes to work them out soon. Hopefully, I will be joined by Dr. Shuka Schwarz, and he will be giving a talk about wildfires that I think you guys are all here to see today. If you have just a couple logistical things, if you guys have questions, you can go ahead and pop those in the Q&A in the chat function, and then we will ask those. I'll facilitate asking those questions at the end of the talk. As we're kind of getting started here and waiting for Dr. Shuka Schwarz to join us, I just wanted to say a little bit about the topic that he's presenting on today, because I know that this is probably fairly relevant to a lot of our lives. If we don't know somebody that is directly affected by the wildfires, or if we are not affected by the wildfires ourselves, we have, I'm sure many of us experienced the smoke. I don't know how many of you can see the background behind me, but you can actually see a little bit of smoke in the sky behind me today. And so it is something that definitely affects all of us. It's certainly affected me this summer. 3 of my immediate family members have had to, in 3 different houses, have had to evacuate from different fires in Colorado and Oregon this summer, and one other immediate family member was under voluntary evacuation orders. So it has definitely been top of mind for me, and I have to say that I think this year, with everything, the wildfires and COVID and technical issues that we're having with live events and live talks, has definitely, made me a more resilient person. And that's, a lot of the research that scientists do is all about trying to help humanity, help communities be more resilient. A lot of the work that Dr. Schwarz does is all about helping to make communities more resilient against wildfires and other, smoke, air quality issues, basically, that are out there. So, so give us just a couple more minutes here to see if we can get Dr. Schwarz on with us. If we can't get his video live, we'll at least be able to share his slides, and he should be able to present by calling in. So just give us a few minutes. If you guys have any questions right now or comments about wildfires in your communities, I'd love to hear them if you want to put them in the chat. Okay, it looks like Dr. Schwarz is joining us. I can at least see his video.
I can see my video. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Great. So let's see. How am I going to share my screen here? Oh, I see open share tray. Hello, everybody. I'm sorry that this is taking a little bit of time, but hopefully we're all sitting outside, not just the 2 of us.
Well, no worries. Keep working on that. I haven't actually introduced the your title of your presentation and so let me do that while you kind of work on figuring out sharing your screen. So, as I mentioned, Dr. Shuka Schwarz is going to be telling us about wildfires today, and specifically how he measures wildfires. In his talk, Fires, Smoke, Airplanes, Action, how we're learning about wildfires and crop burning smoke. So it's a pretty fun topic and really cool with what he actually gets to do with his research. He is a research scientist in NOAA's Chemical Science Laboratory and focuses on measuring black carbon, which is a big particle that's part of wildfire smoke, bioaerosol, and total aerosol, using a lot of instrumentation that can be found in his airplane, detecting aerosolized snow, ice, and liquid samples, modeling of the optical properties of black carbon particles, and then engineering and testing of complex measurement systems in the lab and in the field. So I'm going to turn it over to him, and he's going to tell you all about his fun job where he gets to ride around in airplanes all the time and measure smoke.
Can you guys see my screen with the presentation?
Yes.
Great. So I'll just start then. First, hello everybody. I understand that you're mostly middle school and high school students. What a great time. I hope you enjoy it even during the circumstances. And I hope you're getting really good at finding silver linings. You know that every cloud has a silver lining, and I wish it were true for every smoke plume. But as you can see in this picture on the lower right, it doesn't look like every plume has a silver lining. We'll keep working on that. I understand there's a long question and answer session at the end of this, so feel free to think of questions along the way. And the talk is pretty straightforward, so I've left out a lot. But what it's about is the work we've been doing to understand the impacts of smoke from wildfires and from crop burning mostly. So these are really important for a number of reasons. They make air quality impacts, and of course we've been experiencing that here in Colorado a lot this summer. I think last summer was a little bit better, and maybe the summer before was worse, but in general, air quality is much worse lately because of wildfires in the West. But crop burning in the middle of the country in the Southeast also makes air quality impacts that maybe haven't been as dramatic and therefore perhaps aren't as understood as well. So what we're interested in doing is learning a lot about what's coming out of the fires and so on in order to understand impacts on air quality, climate feedbacks. This is also important. You know, you take all the carbon that's in the forests and you burn it up, goes into the air, and that does all sorts of things, as well as all the particles, so-called aerosols in the smoke and gases. And of course, wildfires can be dangerous. We don't want to forget about that. So here you see a picture that was drawn for us for a mission that we did last year called FireX. And what you see is like a big fire in the middle that's supposed to represent a wildfire. You can see a little kind of straight angle, right angle fire on the lower left that's supposed to represent crop burning. And you can see smoke inundating, affecting a city in the background. And you see lots of airplanes and such all around. And so that's what we're going to be talking about. Now, one thing I did want to show you is this little video, and I don't know if this will come off well, but maybe you can tell me if it's clear enough. What you see is a really big wildfire plume, and the plane, the camera's in the front of the plane, and we just saw that it was really long, and now we're flying towards the source of the smoke, the wildfire. And I wanted to contrast that with what a crop burning fire might look like. So here, same plane, same kind of picture, and you see a teensy weensy little crop burning event going on. Now, not all of them are this small, but it really shows that there's a really wide range to the problems we're facing when we're trying to sample these fires and the smoke and understand what's coming out and how it affects people's health and everything else that we were discussing. So one point about the crop burning is that sure was small, but there can be hundreds of them in a single day, and also bigger than this. And so they really do have impacts. You can see that this was a little bit of a day with little clouds around. People really love to use satellites to get a picture of how many fires there are and where they are. But these very small fires are hard to detect because they're so small. And also if there's a cloud flying over the fire, between the fire and the satellite, then it's a little bit harder to make that measurement. I should say that what the satellites are doing is they're looking at the amount of infrared light coming off of the fire, essentially measuring the heat being emitted by the fire. That gives you a measure of how big the fire is, and it lets you make a guess about how much smoke might be coming up. So kind of a really important way to understand how much smoke is coming out. Now, why are we interested in these things? I had mentioned things about climate and air quality, but who are the people who actually will benefit from what we learn? And so the very first people I thought of were fire modelers. So people who are trying to understand how much fire puts pollution into the air for climate and air quality. But there's also people who model very small scale fire spread. So you can imagine there's a fire on a hill and there's a wind from a certain direction, and there's people who try and understand which way the fire will go so that they can do a better job of directing firefighters towards the places they need to be in advance safely to help stop fires, big wildfires. So there's modeling going on very different length scales. So certainly one of the best things we can do is help modelers. Then there's people who use information from the models as well, like forest managers and farmers. Farmers want to burn their crops to clear the ground. You can ask the farmers about why, but I'm sure that they would prefer it if the smoke wasn't heading directly towards a city. And so they need to know where the smoke is going to go, and the public needs to know what the health impacts of that are. So that also goes through health officials. Now, as you guys might have noticed around here, we see people making decisions about whether they're going to go for a jog based on if it's really smoky, and that's because no one really enjoys being all coffee after a run. So I'd say you, me, and the teacher at least make 3 people who are interested in what's going on here. Now, so that was the what and the why. Sorry, that was the why and the who. And now I'm going to just give you a quick description of what we're doing and the questions we want to answer. So here's this blue box. What's the smoke made of? Pretty important. How much smoke is there? So what is it? How much is there? And where does it go? So these are just kind of simple questions, and you can think about more questions we might be interested in answering. In the question answer period, we can discuss some of those ideas. And I'll try and remember if your idea is completely original and exciting, or if it's one that we also considered. So the biggest tool, I'm an experimentalist. That means I like to do experiments. I like to go out and make measurements. And so I think measurements are really great for understanding these things. And here in the picture, you can see at the very top, there's a whole bunch of different satellite pictures. And those satellites are doing different things. One of the things they do that I mentioned was measuring the fire brightness, as it were, and measuring smoke. You also see a bunch of different planes, and some are at high altitude, some are at lower altitude. I'm going to be focusing just on the really big plane in the kind of middle right where it says processes, that big plane there. That's the NASA DC-8 that we flew last year with all of these other planes. So I'll just be focusing on that one. But we also had ground measurements also coordinating to really try and get a picture of what was going on with the fires and the smoke from all different angles, all different heights. And we also had people who don't really know so much about fire maybe, but really know about what crops might be being burned or what fuels are in the forest fires. So trying to do really a comprehensive look at what's coming out in terms of smoke, what was the fuel feeding it, and so on. But the measurements always go to serve modeling, and the reason is that modeling gives us our best guess at what the impacts are going to be and what's happening on a global scale. So we're really trying to help the models improve with this data. Now, this next slide, what I'm showing you is, well, it's a leftover slide from a different talk that I gave, but what it's showing is on the top, the high resolution rapid refresh model. So that's a NOAA model, and it's trying to make a guess at where smoke might be going. And so this was a model that ran, and everything you see in the top is a prediction for the future from when the model ran. And so it's resetting at the end of something like a 24-hour, 48-hour modeling run. So it's guessing what's going to happen a day or two in advance. And then on the bottom, you can see a satellite picture. This is from one of NOAA's newer satellites, where you can see smoke over the United States. And that picture was taken right at the end of the model run. So you can see these things kind of add up very nicely. They match up really quite nicely. And so it shows that the model is doing a pretty good job of predicting where smoke will go. So that's really important for understanding health impacts. Here we see the fires in the Northwest, and of course the smoke is influencing us in Colorado and all the way to the East Coast, and in fact would probably go to Europe and so on. All right, so finally we get to my favorite topic in this talk, which is the DC-8, the flying laboratory, the big plane that I mentioned before. And here I've got a little video taken by Jose Jimenez from the University of Colorado. And I wonder if I can mute that. Because It's a noisy plane, as we'll discuss. And what he's doing is just walking down the center of the plane as we were on a flight. And you see lots of racks full of instruments. We just passed one that was for remote sensing. It's shooting lasers both above and below the airplane and looking at reflected light to see where smoke is and how much there is. Oop, that was my instrument on the right we just walked past. We're still going up, lots and lots of instruments. At the front of the plane, we tend to have more aerosol instruments, these particles that are in the air. In the back, a little bit more gases and remote sensing. Here's some seats on the right where crew members from the airplane sit up. This guy on the upper left here, his name is Mark, and he was the safety tech on this flight. And now we're going to enter the cockpit. You'll see the two pilots. And then this third guy on the right, he's actually the flight engineer. The plane is old enough that his whole job is looking at the engines and maintaining them. And then on the left, there's what we call the mission scientist. This was Karsten Warnecke from NOAA, who was coordinating with the pilots. So the pilots are great at flying the bus, but they need to hear what's happening with all the instruments in the back in order to know where to go. So this DC-8 has 35 scientists flying on it on each flight with 8 crew members, something like that, I think. And we've got hundreds of measurements, both remote sensing, as I mentioned, with these lasers, and what we call in situ, where we suck air into the plane, into instruments in order to understand what's there, how it's changing, and so on. Oops, we don't want to see that again. I did want to show you that here's a picture of one of the racks of instruments, and there's lots and lots of instruments within each rack. And so some of the common elements that we have in these instruments is we have pumps for those in situ instruments that need to suck air into to be detected. And we use a lot of lasers. Lasers are really great. I can think of an instrument where it's really nice just to use like an old-fashioned light bulb, but they're very rare. Lasers are very handy. And we want to see particles. We want to see the size range of the particles, the composition of the particles. Is it made out of olive oil or vanilla ice cream? Unfortunately, there's not many vanilla ice cream particles in the smokes of the wildfires, but sometimes you do smell a little vanilla, which is kind of interesting. Of course, computers are very important to run it all. And we usually have quite a few gases for instruments that are measuring different kinds of gas. They can use that for calibrations. And sometimes with this smoke, it's very dirty and you need to keep mirrors clean and so on. So just a quick idea of what's going on. But each one of these racks can host a lot of different measurements. Each instrument can even measure many different things sometimes. And here's a picture showing you mostly just people who were associated with the science and operations of this DC-8 plane. So you can see it from the outside. I'm sure I'm in there, but the main point is it's a big effort. It's about $10,000 to fly a plane like this just for 1 hour. And so we want to make sure everything is working. You know, it's always a great opportunity to learn. So I thought it would be interesting to you if we talked about what it's like actually to be on the plane flying. And here on the left is a picture of us flying through a smoke plume where you can see how dim the sun gets. So you get an idea for how dense the smoke was, and you can imagine that we could smell the smoke in the cabin. So very noisy. Everyone's wearing headsets. Here on the right, you can see a picture of Barbara Barletta, who's working on an instrument which sucks up cylinders of air for analysis later. And she's wearing a headset, good for her. And then on the bottom, you can see Matt Coggan in green. And unfortunately, I forget this reporter's name. She flew with us for a flight, and she's not wearing a headset. So it's possible not to wear a headset and to hear things, but it's noisy enough that we don't really like to do that. So it's can be really hot, can be very cold, depending where you're flying. I remember a very cold flight over Antarctica, for example. I remember hot flights down low in California. It can be very bumpy. If you're flying low in California, it's constantly a little bumpy. There's just one microwave, so these flights can last 10 hours. So it's nice to be able to make something, but then depending what you make, it might smell nice on the plane or not so nice. Also, the different fires that we flew through smelled different, which was kind of interesting. There's actually 3 bathrooms on the plane, but the bathroom front, if you use it, when you flush the toilet, what happens is methane and some other gases get released really close to the plane, and then they can get sucked up by instruments. So no one uses that bathroom. It's just not allowed, so that we get good quality data, because we aren't really interested in the bathrooms. Very few rules, which means that while the plane is flying around, usually we can walk around, we can be working on our computers. We're not allowed to really like work on the instruments in case it were to start an electrical problem, but much less rules than on a commercial airliner. But when the pilot says buckle your belt, then of course that's what you do. And as I mentioned, it's a big deal for us to fly this plane. Every hour is very exciting. We get lots of data. There's a lot of chatter about what we're seeing, what it means, the papers we could write, the information we could share. And okay, whoops. So this is actually my last real slide, and what I wanted to show you was just one very special fire that we were able to sample last year that was called a pyrocb, a pyrocumulonimbus event. And so have you guys, Colorado is really great for cumulus clouds and convection. What happens is you see a thunderstorm with a big cloud moving up in the air, and that can be triggered by a fire under certain circumstances. And if that happens, if that happens, then the smoke from the fire gets lifted up much higher than it would otherwise. And this is important because smoke that's very, very high in the air is much less likely to get removed by rain, and it's much more likely to travel long distances. And so we're very interested in it. Also, this is a very rare event, and so there haven't been many opportunities to look at what does the smoke look like once it's been lifted up high by a cloud. So here on the upper left, you can see a fire down low, and you can see smoke from that fire. That was the Williams Flats fire that was in Oregon. Was in Washington? Jeepers. You know, a year goes by and you can't remember anything. But you can see also a nice, beautiful white cloud peaking up at high altitude. And so smoke was getting ingested into that. And then on the right, what you can see is the airplane was flying to sample that smoke. And there was some smoke above it and some smoke below it. So just a very pretty picture. And down at the bottoms, you see a little bit better. This updraft column is showing the cloud coming up high above where the smoke would normally be. And then this residual smoke layer that's high into altitude and can last a long time. All right, so that was, you know, the very basics of what we were doing. I love this picture. I'm afraid I don't remember who took it. That's from a couple years ago with smoke really near Boulder, so where our labs are located, and this is of course the university. So many people from the university and from NOAA in Boulder involved in these missions, but they also included foreigners, private companies. NASA was very, very strongly involved. So really a kind of a national and international effort to understand smoke and fire. And I hope you enjoyed seeing it.
All right. Thank you so much, Josh. That's so interesting. Just all the measurements and stuff that you guys are doing and everything that you have to deal with while you're up there that I think people don't normally think about. So a few questions for you here. A couple questions came earlier on in your talk, and then also as you guys have additional questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. One person wanted to know, and I know this is an area that you study closely, but I think you have some general knowledge about how wildfires are affecting people's health.
Oh, that's a very good question. So, you know, right at the beginning of the talk, I said one of the reasons we want to know is because of health. And so I have heard a bit about how people study these issues, but I think there's still a lot of unknowns about like the chemistry and the biochemistry of what's in the smoke and how it's affecting, for example, people or plants. So unfortunately, I can't address it in very specific terms. What I can say is that the studies that I'm familiar with are all based on connecting smoke events with things like hospital entries and requests for asthma medication from doctors. And those kinds of things. And there's very clear correlations, which is to say, it's very clear that when there's smoke in the area, there's more people being admitted to the hospital for breathing difficulties and so on. And so that's clear, but the actual mechanism of how it affects health certainly isn't clear to me. And my understanding is it's not so clear to the community yet. So it's a very interesting topic. The compositions that we've measured, the specific gases and what's in the aerosol particles will help those people who study those problems have a better approach to deciding what to test.
Okay. Could you tell us a little bit more about your background and kind of the science that you studied, getting up to this point, and kind of, you know, how you got into this field?
Sure. So the background is my backyard. Well, with my 2 kids and wife, and I studied physics at the University of Colorado by chance, but I was focused on a different kind of science than what we're doing now. You guys might have heard that the kilogram was redefined in the international system of units. It used to be a chunk of platinum iridium, and there was an experiment that allowed it to be redefined in terms of the Planck constant. And so that was an experiment that I had worked on years ago, but changing the definition of the kilogram doesn't really affect people's lives in the same way as learning about smoke from fires and eventual impacts on health and so on. So I changed fields from the physics I had been doing, fundamental measurements of fundamental constants, and I decided to try and work on these problems. So I've been at NOAA for more than 15 years, learning about questions of aerosol and smoke.
That's cool. And that's, you know, for all the students that are out there too, if you want to help with human health, it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to be a doctor. You know, you can, so much of the work that scientists do directly impacts and affects human health. So just like what Shuka does. So you talked a lot in your talk about taking data on the plane, but someone's wondering, you know, what other things does your job include? And I find this kind of analogous in a way to what students are going through at the moment, in that they kind of have the in situ days where they may be in school, for those that have the hybrid learning, and then they have days where, you know, they're back at home kind of doing more of those remote learning. So could you talk a little bit more about, you know, what other things your job includes when you're not on the airplane?
Certainly. And well, you know, I wanted everyone to be interested, see the pretty pictures, get excited about the airplane. But the truth of the matter is that we don't fly this airplane all the time. It's a really big deal to get all of those instruments onto the plane. We might have a mission like that lasts a month or 6 weeks, once a year, once every 2 years, actually quite rarely. So we're very excited about those missions, but unfortunately we don't get to do them all the time. What we spend more of our time doing is trying to understand the data that came from those missions and to make sure that everybody else has learned what we've learned. So that means writing papers and publishing papers. And so during this COVID period, actually we had missions that were canceled, and I'll tell you, one of them was in Japan, and it was very exciting science, but because of COVID, we weren't able to do it. And so what we're doing is we're catching up on that side of the science, analyzing the data, getting the papers out. And that doesn't represent such a big change to what we normally do, because these exciting events aren't happening all the time. I can tell you that there are places where people have more missions, more of these airborne missions, not with this particular plane that I was describing. But the problem with having more missions is then you publish less, and the end result of what we're trying to do is share information with everyone else. So it's really striking a balance. And I think this COVID period is about recognizing chances to keep things balanced every way we can.
That's great. That's some really interesting insight there. One final question. This had come up during your talk, and you talked a little bit about this in terms of how you guys predict smoke. But could you talk a little bit more about how computer modeling actually works to enable you to do that?
Ooh. Well, my understanding is you push a button, but unfortunately, it's complicated than that. So there's many different models, and they have many different goals and objectives. So some models I mentioned, they're interested in fire spread, right? And so they tend to work on very, very small areas. what we call a small domain. So maybe it's one hill or one small mountain range where a fire might start. And I've seen pictures of those models' predictions. There's other models that are interested in global scales. So trying to understand the whole Earth. For example, if there's a volcano in Indonesia, and that volcano injects a lot of ash and sulfur dioxide high into the air, where that injected material would go, how long it would stay there, what it would do in terms of sunlight coming into the atmosphere and hitting the planet. And so those models are very different, of course, than when you're just trying to understand not just, but when you're trying to understand how a fire might spread. So there's even very simple models, what we call box models, where you're just doing a very simple model to try and understand if I just have a few chemicals, or maybe more than a few chemicals, in a volume and with some light, what happens to those chemicals? So when we say a model, it can represent all sorts of different things. It could be a model that's describing the whole world. It could be a model that's also coupling in the ocean temperatures and things happening with the oceans or not. And unfortunately, all I can say about the details of how those run is they must really depend on each individual model and what those scientists are trying to learn.
Okay, thank you. We had a couple other questions that just came up at the end there. How often do pyro-CBs happen?
Okay, that's a great question. And part of the reason I think it's great is because I don't think we really know. So we were very lucky that one of the people who was involved in this mission was a meteorologist, somebody who studies weather. Did I say meteorologist or did I say meteorologist? I used to be a meteorologist, so it's very confusing. Meteorologist, so he understands weather, but one of his special focuses is on pyro-CB, and he had come up with a way to predict where pyro-CB would be occurring based on other things in the atmosphere that would make it more likely that a fire could trigger this event. And so he was very excited because he had predicted that and his team, they had predicted that pyro-CB that we were able to measure would occur. So this is representing really people getting a much better approach to answering that question. What I can tell you is there was a big pyro-CB event in 2017. There's fires in Australia. You guys heard about those. They spawned a pyro-CB that was pretty big in the southern hemisphere. But it's not like, oh, every day we have a giant pyro-CB. There could be very small ones. In fact, there was something called, you can imagine that there's you can form a cloud above a fire, but it doesn't really rise up, okay? Those are called pyro-Q. And we saw pyro-Q occurring even on some of the small agricultural fires. So there was a cloud above the fire. It looked like it was formed because of the fire, but it wasn't rising up and doing all these other things that I described. So very much a question. If you can figure out a way to help computers look at satellite data and automate that, I imagine it would be something that's useful.
Cool. And then what could happen, just real briefly, this will be the last question, what could happen if California keeps getting really bad wildfires?
What could happen? Well, you know, we justified Fire X in part by saying that wildfires are increasing in frequency, especially big fires. They're burning in places they didn't burn before. And part of this is also because of people not allowing fires to take place over a long period. So it isn't like a super simple, we can't just blame one bad guy for all of these fires. But you know, I think the very obvious thing is we're seeing that there's really bad health impacts. Well, I should say air quality impacts. And there's reason to believe that those are associated with real health impacts. And so I think what will happen is we'll get used to it and we'll have to do things like the models will get better telling us where the air quality will be bad, and we'll become better about looking at that information before we go for jogs and so on. And then in terms of the longer climate impacts, I don't know yet. Yeah. Okay. Great.
Well, thank you so much. That was very interesting, and I would love to be able to go up in that airplane sometime. I bet a lot of the students would too. So If you guys would like more information about this topic, you can go to our webpage associated with Shuka's talk. I'm also putting the link in the chat there. And that has information on some videos, visualizations that you can look at to keep up to date with kind of what's happening with smokes and wildfires. And then also some lesson plans for elementary, middle, and high school that have students do some hands-on activities related to air quality, learning more about kind of how remote sensing works and some of the instruments that scientists like Dr. Schwarz use in their research, and then some lessons that actually kind of have students exploring like how smoke moves. And how to build kind of more how to look at wildfire impacts in their own communities. So yeah, please feel free to share this. This webinar will be recorded, and so people will be able to view it afterwards. And then join us next week if you can for our Science at Home talk about seismology with Mel Zhang at 1 o'clock next Tuesday. Thank you very much.